There are 7 things you may be doing in public that quietly change the way people perceive you. And the strange part is, most of these behaviors don't look bad. Some of them look polite. Some look friendly. Some look like good manners. Some even look like signs that you're a great listener or an easy person to work with. But there is a difference between being genuinely respectful and constantly signaling that you need other people's approval. That difference is subtle. You can be sitting in a meeting, having dinner with friends, talking to a stranger, speaking with a colleague, or simply standing in a group conversation, and without saying anything directly. Your behavior is communicating something about how comfortable you are with yourself. Your posture says something. Your attention says something. Your silence says something. Even the way you laugh can say something. And most of the time, you're not consciously choosing any of it. You're simply responding. Someone speaks, you nod. A silence appears, you fill it. Someone makes a weak joke, you laugh. Your phone vibrates, you look at it. Someone important enters the room, and suddenly your behavior changes. None of these things automatically mean that you're insecure, weak, or lacking confidence. Human behavior is far more complicated than that. But repeated patterns can influence how other people experience you. This is where the ideas associated with Niccolò Machiavelli become interesting. Machiavelli spent much of his life observing power, leadership, loyalty, reputation, fear, trust, and the way people behave around authority. He understood something that is still relevant today. People don't respond only to what you say. They respond to what your behavior suggests. And that doesn't mean you should walk into every room trying to dominate everyone. Quite the opposite. Real confidence doesn't require constant dominance. It doesn't require making everyone else feel small. And it certainly doesn't require becoming cold or calculating. The point is much simpler. You need to become aware of the signals you're already sending, because once you become aware of them, you can decide which ones you actually want to keep. The first behavior is something almost everyone has done. You nod too much when someone else is speaking. Think about it. Someone starts talking, and your head immediately begins moving. Yes, exactly, right. You nod through the first sentence, the second sentence, the third sentence, and sometimes the entire conversation. You may believe you're simply showing that you're listening, and sometimes you are. A natural nod at the right moment can communicate attention, understanding, or agreement. The problem is when the nod becomes automatic. Your body begins agreeing before your mind has even finished processing what the other person said. It's almost like your head is answering a question your brain hasn't finished hearing, and that creates an interesting social signal. Imagine 2 people sitting across from the same speaker. The first person constantly nods. Every few seconds, their head moves. The second person listens quietly. Their eyes remain engaged. Their posture is relaxed. They don't rush to demonstrate agreement. They simply listen. Now imagine the speaker says something genuinely insightful. The second person gives one slow, deliberate nod. That nod can communicate more than 20 automatic nods. Why? Because it appears intentional. It tells the speaker, I heard that, I considered it, and I agree. The difference isn't that one person is respectful and the other isn't. The difference is that one person's reaction has become predictable while the other's remains meaningful. This is important because confidence isn't always about doing more. Sometimes it's about allowing yourself to do less. You don't have to constantly prove that you're listening. You can simply listen. You don't have to constantly demonstrate agreement. You can take a second to think. And you don't have to treat every statement as something that requires an immediate reaction. There is another reason this matters. When you constantly nod along with someone, especially someone you perceive as more powerful, more experienced, or more important than you may gradually fall into a habit of automatic agreement. You start agreeing before you've evaluated the idea. You start supporting the person instead of evaluating the argument. And eventually, you may discover that you aren't actually listening anymore. You're reacting. This can happen at work. A manager proposes an idea. Everyone around the table starts nodding. You nod too. Then someone asks, "Does everyone agree?" And suddenly you realize you never actually thought about it. You simply followed the rhythm of the room. That is something worth watching in yourself. The goal isn't to stop nodding. That would be ridiculous. The goal is to make your reactions deliberate again. Listen, process, then respond. If you agree, nod. If you disagree, say so respectfully. If you're uncertain, you can simply remain still and think. There's nothing wrong with silence while your brain catches up with the conversation. In fact, thoughtful silence can be a sign of confidence because you're not treating every second of silence as something that must be repaired. And that brings us to the second behavior. You fill every silence. This one is incredibly common. You say something. Nobody responds immediately, and suddenly your brain starts panicking. So you add another sentence. Then another. That's what I mean. I don't know if that makes sense. Maybe I'm wrong. Actually, what I was trying to say was, and before you know it, the original point has disappeared underneath a pile of explanations. The interesting thing is that the other people in the room may never have asked for any of it. The silence wasn't necessarily rejection. Maybe they were thinking. Maybe they were deciding what to say. Maybe they simply needed a second. But because the silence made you uncomfortable, you interpreted it as a problem. So you solved a problem that didn't exist. This happens constantly in meetings. Someone makes a useful point. Then, they keep talking. They explain it again. Then, they soften it. Then they add a qualification. Then, they give 3 examples nobody requested. By the time they're finished, the room may remember the rambling more than the original idea. Compare that with someone who makes a clear point and stops. They don't rush to rescue their statement. They don't immediately ask, "Does that make sense?" They don't apologize for speaking. They simply allow the other people to respond. That doesn't mean silence magically makes someone powerful. It doesn't. But being comfortable with a pause can make communication clearer. And this is where you should be careful with online advice about status. You don't need to sit silently for 10 seconds after every sentence just to look powerful. That would make you look strange. The real lesson is much more practical. Don't speak simply because you're uncomfortable with silence. Speak because you have something useful to add. That's a completely different mindset. Think about an interview. The interviewer asks you a question. You take 2 seconds. You think. Then you answer. There is nothing wrong with that. But many people experience those 2 seconds as an emergency. They think. They're waiting. I have to say something. So they begin talking before they've decided what they actually want to say. The result is often longer, less precise answers. The same thing happens in personal conversations. Someone asks you why you made a particular decision. You could simply answer. But because you're worried about being misunderstood, you begin defending yourself before anyone has accused you of anything. The more you explain, the more uncertain you sound. Again, the solution isn't to become mysterious. It's to become comfortable with your own words. Say what you mean. Then, let it breathe. The third behavior is one people often confuse with friendliness. You laugh when nothing is funny. Not genuine laughter. Nervous laughter. Social laughter. The little laugh you add to the end of a sentence because you're uncomfortable. The laugh you give when your boss makes a weak joke. The laugh you use after saying something serious because you're afraid the room might judge you. The laugh you produce when you don't know what else to do. Laughter is powerful because it communicates emotion very quickly. But when laughter becomes automatic, it stops communicating what you actually feel. Imagine someone makes a mediocre joke at work. You laugh loudly. Other people laugh because they hear you laughing. Now imagine you do that every time. Eventually, your laughter stops telling people anything. It's just background noise. But imagine someone who rarely laughs unless something genuinely amuses them. When that person laughs, people notice. Not because they're trying to create an image, because the reaction is authentic. This is why genuine reactions often feel more powerful than exaggerated ones. You don't need to become emotionally flat. You don't need to stare at people with a completely neutral face. And you certainly don't need to pretend you're above everyone else's humor. If something is funny, laugh. If something is genuinely moving, show it. If something isn't funny, you don't have to manufacture a reaction. That's the entire point. Your reactions should belong to you. Consider how often people use laughter to soften their own opinions. Someone says, "I think this idea is probably terrible." Haha. Why the laugh? Maybe the person genuinely found the situation amusing, but maybe they're protecting themselves. They're communicating an opinion while simultaneously giving everyone permission to reject it. The message becomes, "I think this, but please don't take me too seriously." Sometimes that's useful. Sometimes it's unnecessary. If you have something important to say, you don't always need to wrap it in nervous laughter. Let the statement stand. The fourth behavior is especially relevant in modern life. You check your phone when someone is talking to you. You glance down. You turn the screen over. You check one notification. Then another. You tell yourself you're only looking for a second. But the other person sees it. And even if they don't say anything, they experience a change in the conversation. Think about how you feel when you're speaking to someone and they suddenly look at their phone. You may continue talking. But something changes. You wonder whether they're listening. You may shorten what you're saying. You may lose your train of thought. You may even decide not to share the next thing you were about to say. That's because attention is a form of communication. When somebody gives you their full attention, you feel it. And when they repeatedly take their attention away, you feel that too. This doesn't mean you should never check your phone. Obviously, there are legitimate reasons. You may be waiting for an important message. You may have a family emergency. You may need to check the time. There are countless situations where looking at your phone is perfectly reasonable. The problem is unconscious checking. The hand reaches for the device before you've even decided whether you need it. That's when the phone starts controlling the conversation rather than serving you. Try something simple. When you're having an important conversation, put the phone away. Not face up on the table. Not beside your hand. Away. In your pocket. In your bag. Somewhere outside your immediate field of attention. And then, notice what happens. The conversation often becomes different. People explain more. They make better eye contact. They may become more open, and you become more aware of what they're actually saying. The benefit isn't that you suddenly look more important. The benefit is that you become more present. And presence has become surprisingly rare. We live in a world where almost every spare second can be filled with a screen. Waiting for an elevator? Phone? Sitting in a restaurant? Phone? Standing in line? Phone. Someone pauses during a conversation? Phone. We've become so accustomed to stimulation that a quiet moment can feel uncomfortable. But attention is a choice. And choosing to give someone your full attention can communicate respect more effectively than 100 polite phrases. The fifth behavior is more subtle. You overthank people. And before you misunderstand this, gratitude is a good thing. Thanking people is healthy. Appreciating someone's help is healthy. Showing genuine appreciation is a sign of good character. The problem is not gratitude. The problem is disproportion. You don't need to turn every ordinary interaction into a ceremony. Imagine someone schedules a normal work meeting with you because it's part of their role. You say, "Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. Thank you for meeting with me. I know you're busy." There is nothing inherently wrong with those words. But if you say them repeatedly, especially because you're nervous around that person, you may accidentally communicate that you see the interaction as a favor rather than a mutual exchange. Now imagine a different approach. "Good to see you. Thanks for making the time." Simple, warm, appreciative, then move on. That's usually enough. This distinction becomes particularly useful in professional environments. If somebody goes out of their way to help you, thank them sincerely. If somebody gives you an opportunity, acknowledge it. If someone does you a genuine favor, show appreciation. But don't apologize for existing. Don't thank someone 10 times for allowing you to participate in something you're equally entitled to participate in. And don't assume that being grateful requires making yourself smaller. You can appreciate someone without placing them above you. That's an important difference. There is also a psychological reason people sometimes overthink. They may be trying to reduce uncertainty. If they can make the other person feel appreciated enough, perhaps the other person won't reject them. So gratitude becomes a form of reassurance seeking. "I hope you're okay with me. I hope I didn't inconvenience you. I hope you still like me." The words may sound polite, but underneath them is anxiety. The healthier alternative is proportion. If someone genuinely helps you, say thank you. Mean it. Then continue the relationship normally. You don't have to keep paying emotional interest on a small favor. The sixth behavior is one of the most revealing. You change your energy when someone important enters the room. Imagine you're sitting with friends. You're relaxed. You're talking naturally. You're laughing. Then, your manager walks in. Suddenly, your posture changes. Your voice becomes different. You become more careful with your words. You sit straighter. You start choosing more impressive vocabulary. Maybe you even change the subject. The fascinating part is that you may not notice the transition, but everyone else might. They saw the version of you that existed 5 seconds ago. And then they saw the new version. That doesn't mean you should speak to your boss exactly the same way you speak to your closest friend. Of course, context matters. Professional situations require professionalism. Respect for authority can be appropriate. Good social awareness is not weakness. The issue is when your entire personality changes because someone with higher perceived status enters the room. That reveals something important about your internal state. You're allowing another person's presence to determine your level of comfort. And this happens outside work too. Maybe you're relaxed around ordinary people, but become extremely nervous around wealthy people. Maybe you speak confidently with friends, but become quiet around someone you find attractive. Maybe you act naturally around colleagues, but become a completely different person around senior executives. The common factor isn't the other person, it's the meaning you've assigned to them. You've decided that their opinion matters more. So your nervous system responds accordingly. One useful exercise is to notice these transitions. When someone enters the room, ask yourself, what exactly changed? Did my posture change? Did my voice change? Did I suddenly become more agreeable? Did I start trying to impress them? Did I stop being myself? This isn't about pretending everyone has exactly the same authority. That's unrealistic. A CEO and an intern don't have identical responsibilities. A teacher and a student don't occupy identical roles. A doctor and a patient don't have identical expertise. Context matters. But your basic sense of dignity doesn't have to disappear simply because somebody important walks through the door. You can respect someone's position without becoming intimidated by it. And that brings us to the seventh behavior. This is the one underneath many of the others. You mirror whoever you believe has the most power. You change your pace to match theirs. Your tone changes. Your vocabulary changes. Your posture changes. Your emotional energy changes. You begin unconsciously adapting yourself to the person you think matters most. Some degree of mirroring is completely normal. In fact, humans naturally synchronize with one another. We unconsciously copy expressions, gestures, speech patterns, and rhythms. It can help create connection. It can make conversations smoother. It can help people feel understood. So the problem isn't mirroring itself. The problem is losing your own baseline. There's a difference between adapting socially and abandoning your natural behavior. Imagine a meeting with 5 people. One person is very senior. Whenever they speak, everyone else sits differently. Someone who is speaking confidently suddenly becomes quieter. Someone who is relaxed becomes extremely formal. Another person begins copying the senior person's speaking style. Someone else starts agreeing with almost everything. Now imagine another person in that same room. They're respectful. They're attentive. They listen carefully. But their basic demeanor doesn't collapse. They don't become arrogant. They don't try to dominate. They simply remain themselves. That person may stand out precisely because they aren't desperately trying to adjust. This is where Machiavelli's observations about power become useful as a historical lens. He was fascinated by the relationship between appearance, reputation, authority, and behavior. But we shouldn't turn his work into a modern instruction manual for manipulating people. The more useful lesson is observational. Watch how people behave when they believe someone powerful is watching. That's where you often see the difference between confidence and performance. A person who is comfortable with themselves doesn't need to become identical to the person they admire. They can learn, they can listen, they can adapt, but they don't disappear. And that is the real theme connecting all 7 behaviors. Not dominance, not manipulation, not becoming cold. Self-possession. The ability to remain present without constantly asking the room for permission to exist. Think back to the 7 behaviors. Nodding automatically. Filling every silence. Laughing when nothing is funny. Checking your phone during conversations. Overthanking people. Changing your energy when someone important enters. And mirroring whoever appears most powerful. Look at them carefully, and you'll notice something. They all involve your attention moving away from yourself. You're watching the other person's reaction. You're predicting what they want. You're trying to keep the atmosphere comfortable. You're trying to avoid awkwardness. You're trying to make a good impression. You're trying to avoid rejection. And none of those motivations are inherently bad. Humans are social creatures. Of course we care what other people think. The problem begins when caring becomes constant monitoring. When every conversation becomes a performance. When every silence feels like danger. When every facial expression from another person becomes information you must immediately respond to. That is exhausting, and over time, it can make you forget what your natural behavior actually feels like. So don't approach these 7 behaviors as a list of rules. You don't need to walk around tomorrow thinking, don't nod, don't laugh, don't say thank you, don't look at your phone, don't change your posture. That would be missing the point. Instead, become an observer of yourself. The next time you're in a conversation, notice your head. Are you nodding because you're genuinely following the person's argument, or because you're afraid that not nodding will make you appear unfriendly? Notice your speech. Did you finish your point and then keep talking because the silence made you uncomfortable? Notice your laughter. Did something actually amuse you, or did you laugh because you didn't know what else to do? Notice your phone. Did you need to check it, or did your hand move automatically? Notice your gratitude. Were you genuinely appreciating someone's effort, or were you trying to make sure they knew you were grateful enough? Notice your behavior when someone important arrives. Did your personality change? And finally, notice your mirroring. Did you naturally connect with someone, or did you unconsciously reshape yourself around them? These observations can tell you a lot. And there is one more thing worth understanding. None of these behaviors automatically determine your status. Human beings aren't machines that see a nod and calculate your rank. Social perception is complicated. Culture matters. Personality matters. Context matters. Relationships matter. And the same behavior can mean completely different things in different situations. A person who laughs frequently might simply have an expressive personality. A person who checks their phone might be dealing with an urgent family matter. A person who thanks someone repeatedly might come from a culture where strong verbal gratitude is normal. A person who changes their speech around a senior colleague might simply be demonstrating professionalism. So don't use these ideas to judge everyone around you. Use them to understand yourself. That's where they become useful. Because the goal isn't to become someone who appears powerful. The goal is to become someone who doesn't constantly need to appear a certain way. There's a difference. One is performance. The other is confidence. And confidence doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like listening without rushing. Sometimes it looks like allowing 2 seconds of silence. Sometimes it looks like a genuine laugh instead of a nervous one. Sometimes it looks like putting your phone away. Sometimes it looks like saying thank you once and meaning it. Sometimes it looks like speaking to the CEO with the same basic dignity you show the receptionist. And sometimes it simply looks like breathing normally when the most important person in the room walks through the door. That is self-possession. You don't need to become the loudest person. You don't need to dominate conversations. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need everyone to admire you. In fact, chasing admiration can create the very insecurity you're trying to hide. A person who constantly needs to prove their importance is still allowing other people to determine their sense of importance. The stronger position is quieter. You know what you think. You're willing to reconsider it. You can listen. You can disagree. You can laugh. You can be serious. You can adapt when adaptation is appropriate. But you don't completely disappear into the expectations of the room. And that's something Machiavelli's world can teach us, even though our modern lives are very different from Renaissance Florence. He studied what happens when people mistake a title for authority. A title can be given. A position can be inherited. A reputation can be manufactured. But behavior reveals something deeper. People watch what leaders do when circumstances become uncomfortable. They watch whether the person changes under pressure. They watch whether decisions are consistent. They watch whether words and actions match. The same principle works in everyday life, although on a much smaller scale. People observe how you behave when you're nervous. They observe how you behave around someone you admire. They observe whether you can disagree without becoming defensive. They observe whether you listen. They observe whether you're comfortable with yourself, and often they form impressions before you've consciously tried to create one. That doesn't mean first impressions are always accurate. They're not. Human beings make mistakes constantly. But impressions still influence relationships. So the practical lesson isn't control how everyone sees you. It's become more intentional about how you behave. There's a subtle difference. One is manipulation. The other is self-awareness. And self-awareness is something you can actually practice. Tomorrow, don't try to change all 7 behaviors. Pick one. Maybe it's the phone. For one day, give people your complete attention during important conversations. Or maybe it's silence. When you finish making a point, resist the urge to immediately explain it again. Or maybe it's nervous laughter. Notice when you're laughing without actually finding something funny, or perhaps it's automatic agreement. Listen first. Think, then decide whether you agree. Small changes are easier to sustain than dramatic personality makeovers, and something interesting may happen. You might discover that some of these behaviors aren't actually problems for you. That's perfectly fine. Maybe you naturally laugh a lot. Maybe you use expressive gestures. Maybe you're naturally enthusiastic when listening. Keep those qualities. Confidence isn't about removing personality. It's about removing behavior that you don't actually choose. That's a much healthier goal. Because the objective isn't to become emotionally unavailable. It isn't to become intimidating. It isn't to make other people nervous. And it certainly isn't to manipulate people into giving you respect. The objective is to become less dependent on external validation. When you stop needing every interaction to confirm that you're accepted, your behavior naturally becomes calmer. You listen differently. You speak differently. You react differently. You become less desperate to control the room because you no longer need the room to constantly reassure you. And ironically, that can make you more pleasant to be around. People generally enjoy being around someone who isn't constantly performing. Someone who can listen without interrupting. Someone who can disagree without attacking. Someone who can laugh without pretending. Someone who can put their phone away. Someone who can say thank you without turning gratitude into submission. Someone who can respect authority without being intimidated by it. Someone who can walk into a room full of impressive people and still remember who they are. That's the kind of confidence worth developing. Not the confidence that says, I'm better than everyone here, but the confidence that says, I don't need to be better than anyone here. There is a huge difference. One requires comparison, the other doesn't. So the next time you're sitting in a conversation and you notice your head automatically nodding, pause. The next time a silence appears after you speak, don't immediately run from it. The next time someone makes a joke that doesn't make you laugh, you don't have to manufacture one. The next time your phone lights up during an important conversation, decide whether it actually deserves your attention. The next time you thank someone, let your gratitude be sincere rather than anxious. The next time an important person enters the room, notice whether your entire personality changes. And the next time you catch yourself matching someone else's energy simply because you believe they have more power, come back to your own baseline. Your own voice. Your own pace. Your own judgment. Your own presence. Not rigidly. Not artificially. Just naturally. Because the goal was never to become the person everyone else follows. The goal is to stop becoming a different person every time someone else walks into the room. And perhaps that's the most useful lesson hidden inside all 7 behaviors. You don't need to control the room. You need to control your own reactions. You don't need to make people respect you. You need to behave in a way that is consistent with your own values. You don't need to eliminate every awkward moment. You need to become comfortable enough with yourself that an awkward moment doesn't feel like a threat. You don't need to win everyone's approval. You need to become comfortable when approval isn't immediately available. That is a much deeper form of confidence. And once you start practicing it, you'll probably notice something else. Other people may not change at all. The room may be exactly the same. Your colleagues may be exactly the same. Your friends may be exactly the same. The person across the table may be exactly the same. But your experience of the interaction changes because you're no longer spending every second monitoring yourself through somebody else's eyes. You're actually there. Listening, thinking, speaking, observing, responding, living the conversation instead of performing it. And that is something worth practicing long after this video ends. So look back at today. How many times did you automatically agree? How many times did you fill a silence that didn't need filling? How many times did you laugh because you genuinely found something funny? And how many times did you laugh simply because you felt uncomfortable? How often did your phone steal your attention? How often did you make yourself smaller through unnecessary apologies or excessive gratitude? Who makes you change the way you speak? Who makes you change the way you sit? Who makes you suddenly feel that you need to prove yourself? And perhaps the most important question, when nobody in the room seems more important than you, how do you naturally behave? That version of you is worth getting to know, not because it's necessarily perfect, but because it's yours. You can improve it. You can make mistakes. You can become more thoughtful. You can become more socially skilled. You can become a better listener. You can become more confident. But you don't have to build your personality around whoever happens to be standing in front of you. There will always be people with more money, more followers, more experience, more authority, more impressive titles, more social influence. That's life. If your confidence depends on being the most impressive person in the room, you will spend your entire life feeling threatened by other people's achievements. But if your confidence comes from knowing who you are and how you want to behave, someone else's success doesn't take anything away from you. That's freedom. And perhaps that's where the deepest lesson lies. Status, reputation, confidence, and influence are often discussed as if they're things you acquire from other people. But the foundation begins internally. Not with pretending, not with manipulation, not with performing dominance, with self-awareness. Notice your habits. Question your automatic reactions. Decide what deserves your attention. Say what you mean. Listen when someone else speaks. Allow silence to exist. Laugh when you're genuinely amused. Express gratitude when gratitude is deserved. Respect people without worshiping them. And remain yourself when the room changes. Because you don't have to broadcast superiority. You don't have to prove that you're important. You don't have to make other people feel insignificant. You simply need to stop abandoning yourself every time you want someone's approval. And once you stop doing that, something changes. Not necessarily in the way social media advice promises. People won't suddenly bow down to you. Every conversation won't become easier. Everyone won't respect you. And you won't magically become the most charismatic person in every room. Real life doesn't work that way. What changes is something much more valuable. You become more comfortable in your own presence. You become less reactive. You become more deliberate. You become better at listening. You become clearer when you speak. And you become less dependent on the room telling you that you're okay. That's a kind of confidence that doesn't need an audience. And that is probably worth far more than appearing powerful ever could. If this made you think differently about your own behavior, don't try to change everything at once. Choose one habit. Watch it for the next week. Notice when it appears. Notice what triggers it. Notice what you're feeling immediately before you do it. Then, decide whether you actually want to keep doing it, because awareness comes before change. And once you start noticing your own patterns, you may realize that the most important transformation isn't learning how to control other people. It's learning how little you need to control them. You can walk into a room without calculating who has the highest status. You can have a conversation without trying to win it. You can listen without constantly signaling agreement. You can speak without apologizing for every sentence. You can be silent without assuming something has gone wrong. You can laugh without performing. You can put the phone away and actually be present. You can appreciate people without placing yourself beneath them. And you can respect powerful people without becoming a different version of yourself in their presence. That is the kind of psychological strength that lasts. Not the ability to control anyone, the ability to remain yourself. And once you have that, you may find that you don't need to chase status nearly as much as you thought. Because the strongest signal isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes it's simply consistency. The same person in the quiet room, the same person in the crowded room, the same person talking to a stranger, the same person talking to a CEO, the same person when everyone is watching, and the same person when nobody is. That is when your behavior stops being a performance. It becomes character. And character is much harder to fake. If one of these 7 behaviors stood out to you, take a moment and think about which one appears most often in your own life. Maybe it's the constant nodding. Maybe it's filling silence. Maybe it's nervous laughter. Maybe your phone constantly steals your attention. Maybe you overthink people. Maybe you become a different version of yourself around authority. Or maybe you recognize yourself in the final one, constantly adjusting your behavior to whoever seems most powerful. Whatever it is, don't judge yourself for noticing it. You can't change a pattern you refuse to see. Awareness isn't criticism. It's the beginning of choice. And from this point forward, you have a choice. You can keep reacting automatically. Or you can start responding deliberately. You can keep asking the room who you should be. Or you can decide for yourself. The difference may look small from the outside, but internally, it can change everything. And that is where real confidence begins.